One last thing. If you could possibly return this to Fred's for me, please.
Yes, of course.
Of course, please.
He was Hollywood's perfect gentleman, the man whose eyes could silence a room. But at the height of his fame, Richard Gere vanished. No red carpets, no blockbusters, nothing. Why? Was it the shocking speech that got him banned from the Oscars for 20 years? The outrage in India, where his face was burned in the streets? Or was it a darker truth one Hollywood never wanted you to hear? Stay with me, because this is the story that will change the way you see him forever. Richard Gere was never just another actor. He was the kind of presence that felt larger than the screen itself, a man who didn't need to shout or even speak to be unforgettable. If you had only seen him once, perhaps in Pretty Woman, you already knew. His gaze carried more weight than entire pages of dialogue. That look was calm yet piercing, confident yet strangely vulnerable, and it had the power to quiet a crowded theater without a single word. For over 30 years, Gere represented something rare in Hollywood. He wasn't only a leading man, he was a different kind of leading man. His smile wasn't the manufactured charm of a studio-trained star, but something that felt natural, almost reluctant, as if he smiled only when he meant it. His stillness on screen wasn't emptiness, it was depth. A silence that pulled audiences closer because they wanted to know what he was thinking, what he was hiding. In a city that often worships noise, speed, and spectacle, Richard Gere became the gold standard of elegance. He carried himself with an ease that others couldn't imitate, both on screen and off. At premieres, at interviews, even walking quietly on the streets of New York, he radiated a kind of understated grace. He wasn't chasing attention, attention chased him. But what made Gere extraordinary wasn't just his polished surface, it was the mystery beneath it. For while most actors seemed eager to belong to Hollywood, Gere always gave the impression that he stood slightly apart from it, as though he were visiting, not living there. He was magnetic, but elusive, adored by millions, yet somehow unknowable. And then, when Hollywood still wanted him, when the world was still watching, he made the most shocking choice of all. He stepped away. At first, it was subtle, a missed premiere here, a declined role there. Richard Gere, the man who once lit up box offices around the world, began quietly saying no. He turned down blockbuster scripts that other actors would have fought for, stepped away from the red carpets that once celebrated him, and slowly disappeared from the spotlight that had made him immortal. To millions watching, it felt like he had simply vanished, leaving behind only questions. Why? Why would a man who had everything, fame, wealth, and the love of audiences across the globe choose silence over applause? Why would he walk away from the dream so many spend their lives chasing? Some whispered it was because of a single sentence, the one spoken live at the Oscars, that cost him 2 decades of exile from Hollywood's biggest night. Others believed it was his personal life, the strangely beautiful romances that seemed to bloom suddenly, then vanish just as quietly, leaving behind only speculation. And then there were those who felt it was something deeper, something unspoken, that perhaps Gere had never truly belonged to Hollywood at all, that while he could dazzle in its light, his soul had always longed for the shadows. And yet, there was still another reason, one nobody had expected, because behind Richard Gere's journey was a woman who would completely transform his world. A woman with a background so surprising, so unlike the glitter of Hollywood, that her presence would shift the course of his life forever. The mystery of Richard Gere's disappearance wasn't just about the films he didn't make, or the stages he walked away from. It was about the man himself, a man who seemed to be searching not for fame, not for applause, but for something far more rare, a way to simply exist on his own terms. To understand why Richard Gere would one day turn his back on Hollywood, you have to go back to where it all began, not in the bright lights of Los Angeles, but in the quiet streets of Philadelphia. Richard Tiffany Gere was born on the 31st of August, 1949, the second of 5 children in a modest, middle-class household. His father, Homer, sold insurance. His mother, Doris, devoted her life to raising their children. When Richard was still a boy, the family moved to upstate New York. It was the 1900 952nd, a time of discipline, frugality, and strong community values. In that simple, ordered environment, little Richard learned the virtues of hard work and humility. There was no chaos in the Gere household, no loud scandals or family dramas. Instead, there was routine, stability, and a quiet rhythm that shaped his character. It was in that stillness that Richard's sensitive soul first began to take root. Unlike many of his peers, Richard wasn't drawn to mischief or rebellion. He was curious, thoughtful, and deeply observant, qualities that would later make him magnetic on screen. His parents nurtured those gifts quietly, never pushing him toward fame, but always encouraging education, integrity, and self-discipline. That early foundation mattered, because while other future stars might have grown up surrounded by chaos or driven by a hunger to escape their beginnings, Richard's roots gave him something else, a sense of inner calm. And as the world would one day learn, that calm, that ability to hold silence and stillness, would become his greatest strength as an actor, and the very quality that made him unforgettable. As Richard grew older, that quiet sensitivity began to bloom into something unmistakable: talent. At North Syracuse Central High School, he didn't just stand out, he seemed to belong everywhere at once. He could sit at a piano and let his fingers glide across the keys, switch to a guitar or a trumpet, and just as easily compose an original piece for the school's musical productions. Music wasn't simply an interest for him, it was a language he spoke fluently, a way to express the emotions he rarely said out loud. But Richard wasn't just the artist, he was also the athlete. He excelled at lacrosse and gymnastics, the latter requiring the same grace, discipline, and balance that would later define his screen presence. His skills earned him a sports scholarship, proof that he could have followed an entirely different path if he had wanted. Even in sports, though, he wasn't just chasing victory. He was testing the limits of his body and mind, seeing how discipline and freedom could coexist. And he wasn't only performing in music halls or competing on the field. Gere also shined in leadership, serving on the student council, where he proved he could carry responsibility and command respect. He wasn't loud or domineering, but people listened when he spoke. That quiet authority, even as a teenager, was already visible. In 1967, Richard enrolled at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, majoring in philosophy. It was a choice that revealed his restless curiosity, his need to ask the big questions. Who are we? What is truth? What does it mean to live fully? But 2 years later, he would walk away from that conventional path, deciding to pursue music and eventually acting. It was a decision that disappointed his family, but defined his life. For Gere, living according to someone else's expectations was never an option. His gifts, musical, physical, intellectual, were too expansive to be contained in a classroom. He had to find a stage, somewhere, anywhere, to express them. And once he did, the world would never forget. By 1973, Richard Gere had left behind the safety of college life and plunged headfirst into the uncertain world of performance. While many of his peers were still deciding what careers to pursue, Gere was already standing under bright stage lights in London, playing one of the most iconic roles of the era, Danny Zuko, in the hit rock musical Grease. This wasn't just another role, it was his introduction to the West End, one of the most prestigious stages in the world. As Danny, Gere wasn't merely acting, he was commanding. His presence was so magnetic that audiences quickly realized they weren't just watching another young actor, they were witnessing a performer who could sing, dance, and hold the stage with a confidence far beyond his years. It was clear that his background in music, his mastery of multiple instruments, and his natural rhythm gave him an edge no one else had. But Gere wasn't content with staying safe in the world of light-hearted musicals. He craved depth, challenge, and roles that would push him to his limits. He ventured into Shakespeare with The Taming of the Shrew, testing himself with the rigor and precision of classical theater. And then came Bent, a groundbreaking play about homosexual love in a Nazi concentration camp. It was bold, it was dangerous, and it showed that Gere, even in the earliest days of his career, was unafraid of roles that demanded courage, vulnerability, and emotional risk. Each stage production added another layer to his craft. Audiences saw charisma, but underneath, Gere was quietly building the discipline that would later make his film performances unforgettable. He was learning how to communicate volumes with silence, how to hold attention with nothing more than stillness, lessons that would one day become his trademark on screen. The theater gave him his first true identity as an artist. And though the lights of Broadway and the West End were bright, they were only the beginning. Hollywood was already waiting, and it was about to change everything. Hollywood didn't embrace Richard Gere all at once. His first steps into film were small, almost quiet, but they carried a kind of electricity that people couldn't ignore. In 1977, he appeared in Looking for Mr. Goodbar. The role was minor, but even in those few minutes on screen, Gere radiated something different. His rugged presence, that mix of danger and allure, caught the attention of directors who saw more than just another handsome face. They saw potential, the kind of raw magnetism that could one day carry an entire film. And in 1978, that chance came. Gere was cast in Terrence Malick's Days of Heaven, a film now considered a cinematic masterpiece. With its breathtaking imagery and poetic pacing, it required actors who could speak with more than words, and Gere was perfect for it. Though he had very little dialogue, his eyes told a story on their own. Longing, restlessness, an inner world that seemed both mysterious and deeply human. Critics and audiences alike walked away remembering him, even if they couldn't explain why. But it was in 1980 that Richard Gere truly stepped into the spotlight. American Gigolo wasn't just a film. It was a cultural shockwave. Playing Julian Kay, a high-priced escort navigating a life of seduction and danger, Gere redefined what it meant to be a Hollywood sex symbol. His performance was more than physical charm, it was layered, psychologically complex, even tormented. He wasn't a cardboard cutout of desire. He was a man full of contradictions, and that made him unforgettable. The role launched him into superstardom, but it also marked something more important. Gere was carving out a path of his own. He wasn't chasing safe, conventional leading man roles. He was willing to take risks, to embody characters that were flawed, dangerous, and yet magnetic. With the discipline he had learned from theater, and the natural stillness that was becoming his signature, he didn't need bombastic speeches or exaggerated gestures. Just a single glance could hold the audience captive. These early films didn't just introduce Richard Gere to Hollywood, they announced him as a force unlike anyone else, a performer who could command attention without demanding it, and who would soon change the very idea of what a leading man could be. If American Gigolo made Richard Gere a star, it was An Officer and a Gentleman in 1982 that transformed him into a legend. Here, Gere stepped into the role of Zach Mayo, a young Navy officer in training scarred by his past, stubborn in his independence, yet yearning for something greater. The film wasn't just another love story or military drama. It was a test of character, resilience, and the power of transformation. For Gere, this was the perfect role at the perfect time. Zach Mayo wasn't simply tough, he was layered. He carried pain in his silence, pride in his defiance, and vulnerability in the way he allowed love to soften him. Gere poured himself into the part, channeling both the discipline he had mastered on stage and the inner complexity that had begun to define his screen presence. The result was unforgettable. The now iconic final scene, Zach in his crisp white uniform, lifting Deborah Winger's character into his arms and carrying her out of the factory as workers erupted in applause, became one of the most celebrated moments in cinematic history. It was more than just romance. It was a symbol of triumph, of love conquering hardship, of hope against despair. Audiences left theaters stunned, many with tears in their eyes. The film didn't just succeed, it soared, pulling in millions at the box office and cementing Gere as the kind of actor who could not only embody romance but also deliver emotional depth that felt raw and real. And Hollywood took notice. This was no longer a rising star, this was a man who had redefined what a leading man could be. An Officer and a Gentleman won 2 Academy Awards. But for Richard Gere, the greatest reward was something more profound. He had entered the cultural imagination. From that moment on, he wasn't just Richard Gere the actor. He was Richard Gere, the legend, the man whose eyes, whose silence, whose very presence could move an audience to believe in love, redemption, and transformation. If An Officer and a Gentleman made audiences fall in love with Richard Gere, then Pretty Woman in 1990 made him eternal. It wasn't just another romantic comedy, it was lightning in a bottle. The rare kind of film that defined an entire generation and forever etched Gere's name into cinematic history. The premise could have easily slipped into cliché. A wealthy, emotionally detached businessman and a vivacious sex worker meet by chance, only to find themselves transformed by love. But what made the film unforgettable wasn't the storyline, it was the chemistry. Richard Gere and Julia Roberts didn't just act together, they created magic. Gere's approach was strikingly subtle. He didn't try to charm his way through the film with grand gestures or witty lines. Instead, he leaned into silence, into stillness. He let Julia Roberts shine, laughing with her, watching her with quiet intensity, giving her space to fill the screen with her energy. And that restraint was what made their dynamic irresistible. He didn't need to dominate the film by holding back. He gave it balance, grace, and truth. Audiences around the world couldn't get enough. Pretty Woman grossed over $460 million globally, transforming Julia Roberts into America's sweetheart and cementing Richard Gere as one of the most beloved romantic leads of all time. For many, the image of Gere in that sleek suit, quietly smiling at Roberts' infectious laugh, remains one of the most enduring visions of Hollywood romance. But the film was more than just a commercial triumph. It marked a cultural moment. Gere became the embodiment of a new kind of masculinity, elegant, composed, mysterious, yet capable of tenderness. He wasn't the loud, muscular action hero of the era. He was something softer, more refined, and infinitely more human. From that moment forward, Richard Gere wasn't just a star, he was a symbol. To millions of fans, he was the face of romance itself, proof that sometimes a quiet glance could say more than 1,000 words. After the global phenomenon of Pretty Woman, many actors might have struggled to live up to such a towering success. But Richard Gere did something remarkable. Instead of chasing louder blockbusters or reinventing himself to fit Hollywood trends, he allowed his career to grow naturally, with a quiet confidence that mirrored his on-screen presence. Throughout the 1992nd and 2002nd, Gere carefully chose roles that deepened, rather than diluted, his image. In 1999, he reunited with Julia Roberts in Runaway Bride, a film that might have been lighthearted on the surface, but carried the nostalgic magic of their earlier collaboration. Audiences rushed to see them together again, and Gere proved he could still hold the screen with warmth, subtle humor, and the romantic gravitas only he could deliver. Then came Chicago in 2002, the dazzling musical that reminded everyone just how versatile Gere truly was. As slick lawyer Billy Flynn, he blended charisma with satire, delivering show-stopping numbers that revealed his roots in music and theater. His performance won him a Golden Globe, and the film itself went on to take home the Oscar for Best Picture. It was a reminder that Gere wasn't just a romantic lead, he was an artist capable of shifting between genres with ease. In Shall We Dance, 2004, Gere revealed yet another side of himself, a middle-aged husband rediscovering joy and passion through dance. It wasn't the image of a perfect hero, but of a man yearning for connection, mirroring the quiet questions Gere himself was asking off-screen about love, purpose, and fulfillment. Even into the 2010 he continued to surprise. In Arbitrage, 2012, he played a wealthy CEO torn apart by moral dilemmas and ambition. It was a darker, sharper role, one that showed Gere could embody not only romance and elegance, but also corruption and conflict. Critics praised the performance as one of his finest, proving his depth had only grown with time. What stood out across all these films was Gere's refusal to be consumed by Hollywood's obsession with spectacle. He never needed superheroes, CGI explosions, or scandal to remain relevant. Instead, he sustained his star power through something rarer: maturity. Each decade revealed a new Richard Gere, older, wiser, more reserved, but just as magnetic as ever. And that was the secret. Gere didn't fight to stay in the spotlight. He allowed the spotlight to adapt to him. His career endured not because he clung to fame, but because he lived it with grace, letting his artistry evolve alongside his life. Even as Richard Gere's star was rising, his personal life unfolded in ways that revealed the quiet complexity behind the Hollywood image. His first serious relationship began in 1971 with actress Penelope Milford, known for Coming Home. For 7 years, they lived far from the spotlight, sharing a modest apartment in New York. These were not glamorous years filled with paparazzi flashes, but years of endurance, sacrifice, and discovery. Penelope stood by Gere when he was still an unknown, when auditions ended in rejection, and when self-doubt clouded his future. Their relationship was proof that even before the world adored him, someone had already believed in him completely. When they eventually parted ways in the late 1972, Gere's life entered a new phase. Fame was arriving, and with it came relationships that were shorter, more fragile, and heavily scrutinized. He dated Tuesday Weld, a strong-willed actress who warned him bluntly, "Fame will swallow your emotions." He spent time with Barbara Carrera, a striking Nicaraguan actress who appeared by his side just as American Gigolo was transforming him into a cultural sex symbol. But amid all the fleeting names and headlines, one relationship stood apart: Sylvia Martins, a Brazilian painter. With Sylvia, it wasn't about red carpets or magazine covers. It was about something deeper. For nearly a decade, from 1978 to 1986, she was his anchor during the years he rose from promising actor to international star. Together, they traveled to Tibet, attended meditation retreats, and explored spiritual practices that would eventually become central to Gere's identity. She wasn't just a lover, she was a companion on his search for meaning. Those years shaped him in ways Hollywood never could. With Sylvia, he learned to see beyond the image, to ask himself who he really was when the cameras were off and the applause was gone. While the public saw Gere as the ultimate romantic figure, Sylvia knew the man behind the mask, thoughtful, restless, yearning for stillness. By the time that relationship ended, Gere had changed. He no longer sought love as a public spectacle or a glamorous accessory. He was searching for something quieter, something that ran deep enough to help him escape the noise of his own fame. And that search would lead him into even more fascinating and complicated romances. As Richard Gere's fame reached its peak in the early 1982, the press circled closer, hungry for stories that matched his image as Hollywood's ultimate romantic symbol. And then came the whispers of a rumored romance with none other than Barbra Streisand. At the time, Gere was still basking in the afterglow of American Gigolo, newly minted as the sex symbol of a generation, while Streisand was already untouchable, a living legend with an Oscar, Grammys, and complete control over her career and image. The tabloids called it a collision of galaxies. The age gap, 6 years, surprised some. But what truly captivated the public was the idea that Barbara herself had pursued Gere. Whether that was true or not, neither of them ever confirmed it. Instead, they fueled the speculation with knowing glances on red carpets, secretly snapped photos of private meetings, and long silences that only made people more curious. It wasn't difficult to imagine what drew them together. Gere, with his bold charisma and mysterious stillness, and Streisand, with her uncompromising independence and larger-than-life presence, were opposites that made sense. For a time, they seemed like an unlikely but intoxicating pair. But in the end, their differences were too vast. Gere longed for solitude, for inner peace, for a kind of life that was rooted in stillness. Streisand had been born into the spotlight and thrived on its energy. To live together would have meant forcing one of them to abandon their true nature. So, as quietly as it began, it ended. No scandals, no public fights, just two powerful individuals walking away before their worlds could truly collide. Yet the rumors lingered, and with them, a lingering question. Was Richard Gere searching for a love that could glow privately, away from the cameras, rather than one that burned brightly in public? After Streisand, the list of names associated with Gere continued to grow. Priscilla Presley, Elvis's widow, was spotted with him in Los Angeles. Designer Lori Rodkin was linked briefly. Kim Basinger's name surfaced in gossip columns, as did those of Tina Chow, Delilah DeLazzaro, and Laura Bailey. Some encounters may have been exaggerated, others fleeting, but all pointed to the same truth: Gere remained irresistible, even as he himself seemed increasingly detached from Hollywood's games. These years revealed a pattern. While the world tried to define Richard Gere by the women at his side, he was quietly searching for something entirely different. Love, for him, wasn't about appearances. It was about depth, connection, and perhaps an escape from the very image the world had created for him. By the late 1982nd, Richard Gere was no longer just a movie star, he was a cultural icon. And then, in 1988, fate introduced him to someone who would turn his personal life into just as much of a spectacle as his films: Cindy Crawford. At only 22 years old, she was already one of the most famous supermodels on the planet, her face appearing on magazine covers around the globe. Gere, then 39, was at the height of his pretty woman glow. They met casually at a backyard barbecue hosted by photographer Herb Ritz. But that simple encounter sparked a romance that would quickly become one of the most talked-about relationships of the decade. The press soon crowned them the golden couple of the 1992nd. Their marriage, 3 years later in Las Vegas, was the opposite of Hollywood extravagance. No lavish gowns, no long guest lists, no paparazzi. Just the two of them and a pair of aluminum foil rings. To the world, it looked spontaneous, intimate, and even rebellious, as though they were thumbing their noses at Hollywood's obsession with spectacle. From 1991 to 1995, Gere and Crawford were everywhere. Their peak came at the 1991 Academy Awards, where they appeared on the red carpet hand in hand, Gere's rugged elegance perfectly offset by Crawford's icy beauty. That single image was immortalized in pop culture, a vision of glamour that seemed untouchable. But behind the photographs and red carpet smiles, pressures were mounting. Whispers circulated that their marriage was only for show, that Gere was hiding his sexuality, that Crawford was too young to understand what she wanted. The gossip became so vicious that in 1994, the couple spent $30,000 on a full-page ad in the London Times, publicly declaring, "We are heterosexual, monogamous, and deeply committed to each other. We are not and never have been planning to divorce." They even listed the humanitarian causes they supported together, from AIDS research to LGBTQ+ rights, ending with a plea, "Be honest, responsible, and kind." Yet even this defiant stand couldn't silence the questions within their marriage. In an interview with Vanity Fair that same year, Crawford admitted that the ad had been Gere's idea because he couldn't bear the image of being seen as dishonest. She also confessed that, at just 28, she was beginning to wonder, "Who am I in this relationship? I've changed so much to become the woman he needs, but am I still myself?" Years later, Gere would admit the truth of their struggles. "I loved someone who didn't yet know who she was, and I hoped love would help her settle. That was an unfair expectation." By 1995, the marriage ended quietly, with no courtroom battles, no bitter public feuds. Cindy went on to marry businessman Rand Gerber and raise 2 children, while Gere continued on his restless journey for meaning. But to this day, that one image of Gere and Crawford perfectly poised, hand in hand on the red carpet, remains frozen in time. For audiences, it wasn't just a photograph. It was a dream of perfection, a dream that, like so many in Hollywood, couldn't last. After the turbulence of his high-profile marriage to Cindy Crawford, Richard Gere seemed to be searching for something quieter, something that resembled stability. And in 1995, he found it when he met Carrie Lowell, a former model, Bond girl, and later a familiar face on television through Law and Order. Unlike the glamour-soaked world he had just left behind, Carrie brought a steadiness, a grounded presence that felt less like spectacle and more like home. For 7 years, they built a life together before marrying in 2002. By then, they had already welcomed their son, Homer James Jigme, and had chosen to live far from the chaos of Hollywood. On their farm in upstate New York, Gere grew organic vegetables, read Buddhist texts, and accepted only those film roles that offered some spiritual or artistic depth. To the public eye, it looked as though he had finally found what he had always longed for: a family, a sanctuary, and a rhythm of life that was slow, steady, and whole. But peace, even when it looks perfect, isn't always permanent. As the years passed, subtle cracks began to show. Carrie, who had once thrived in social circles, started to feel restless in the silence of Gere's increasingly inward world. While he devoted hours each day to meditation and spiritual reflection, she longed for connection, for conversation, for shared experiences that lived outside of stillness. It wasn't anger that grew between them, it was distance, not betrayal, but a slow, inevitable drifting apart. By 2013, after 18 years together, they separated. What shocked the public wasn't just the end of their relationship, but the battle that followed. For the first time, the man so often seen as serene, almost untouchable in his composure, appeared visibly shaken. The quiet separation turned into a legal standoff that dragged on for nearly 3 years, with $100 million in assets placed on the table. The media captured images that seemed out of character. Gere walking into court with a tense expression, even once aiming a sharply tipped black umbrella at a photographer, a flash of anger, of vulnerability, that broke through the calm Buddhist image he had cultivated for decades. For Carrie, remaining in their Bedford home meant continuity for their son, but beneath it all lay a fierce tug of war over trust, emotions, and space. A close friend later reflected, "No one betrayed anyone. They just stopped understanding each other, even while living under the same roof. And when the settlement was finally reached, it was as quiet as the love had once been. No triumphant ending, just silence, the same silence that had always defined Gere's life, for better and for worse." After the drawn-out end of his marriage to Carrie Lowell, Richard Gere stepped into a period of transition, one marked not by scandal or noise, but by a search for companionship that felt real and lasting. In 2014, he was briefly linked to Padma Lakshmi, the glamorous host of Top Chef. Both were emerging from painful divorces, and for a few months their relationship seemed to offer a sense of healing. Yet, it ended as quietly as it began. No public arguments, no bitterness, just two people realizing that their lifestyles and needs no longer aligned. Gere was moving deeper into introspection, drawn to solitude and spiritual calm, while Padma remained rooted in the fast-paced media world. But destiny had something else in store. Later that same year, Gere reconnected with Alejandra Silva, a Spanish activist and businesswoman 33 years his junior. They had known each other years earlier through family friends, but this time, their meeting was different. Alejandra was newly divorced, raising her son in Italy, while Gere was navigating life after separation. What began as small gestures, flowers sent, handwritten letters delivered across continents, soon blossomed into something profound. Gere didn't rush her. He simply showed up, consistently, offering presence instead of pressure. The age gap made headlines, but for the couple, it was never the point. What bonded them wasn't glamour but shared values, compassion, humanitarian work, and the conviction that love should feel like sanctuary, not spectacle. Despite living on different continents, they made a promise never to let more than 20 days pass without seeing each other. Eventually, Alejandra chose to move to New York, where they quietly built a blended family alongside Gere's son, Homer. In April 2018, they formalized their union with a private Buddhist ceremony at Gere's Pound Ridge estate, attended by Tibetan monks. A month later, a small Cinco de Mayo celebration followed, where Alejandra wore 2 custom gowns. She didn't appear as a star's trophy wife, but as an independent woman beginning a new chapter. Together, they welcomed 3 children into their family: Albert, Alejandra's son from her previous marriage, and their 2 boys, Alexander, 2019, and James, 2020. Alejandra's own character only deepened the admiration. In 2015, she had slept on the streets of Madrid to understand the struggles of the homeless she was working to help. She ran a foundation dedicated to eradicating homelessness in Spain and carried herself not with celebrity vanity, but with empathy and grit. For Gere, her presence was a revelation, a partner who not only understood his humanitarian drive, but shared it wholeheartedly. By 2024, the couple relocated to Madrid, living a life that combined family intimacy with purposeful activism. On Gere's 75th birthday, Alejandra wrote, "After 11 years together, it still feels like day one. The life we've built, the memories we've shared, it's more than I ever imagined." For a man who had spent decades wandering between Hollywood glamour and spiritual solitude, Alejandra Silva represented balance. She was not the spotlight, nor the silence. She was the calm in between and in her. Richard Gere finally seemed to have found home. For years, Richard Gere had been Hollywood's gentleman, elegant, magnetic, and carefully admired. But on one unforgettable night, he revealed something else, a man who refused to remain silent. It was the 29th of March, 1993, the Academy Awards. Gere had been invited to present the Oscar for Best Art Direction, and like every presenter, he was expected to follow the script word for word. Keep it light, smile, hand over the statue, and leave the politics at the door. That was the rule. But Richard Gere wasn't a man who lived by rules of convenience. Standing under the glare of the cameras, in front of over 1 billion viewers worldwide, he went off script. Instead of platitudes, he spoke of Tibet, of human rights, and of freedom. With calm but firm conviction, he looked directly into the camera and said, "I send love, truth, and a little sanity to Deng Xiaoping. Would you consider withdrawing all your troops from Tibet and letting those people live freely?" The auditorium froze. The glamorous room, usually buzzing with polite applause and whispered chatter, fell into stunned silence. Around the world, audiences sat in shock. In just a few sentences, Gere had crossed the invisible line that so many stars tiptoe around, speaking truth to power, knowing full well the cost. And the cost was devastating. Within days, Gere was quietly blacklisted from the Academy. He wasn't officially expelled, but for the next 2 decades, he was never again invited to present or attend the Oscars. What's more, Hollywood itself began to close its doors. The reason wasn't whispered, it was understood. By the 1992nd, the Chinese box office was becoming critical to Hollywood's bottom line, and Gere's outspoken criticism of China made him a liability. Studios that once fought to work with him suddenly turned away. Years later, Gere reflected bitterly, "I used to have movies released globally. Then suddenly, no major studio wanted to work with me anymore. No one said it outright, but everyone knew why." In 2015, more than 2 decades later, Oscar host Conan O'Brien even joked in Mandarin during the ceremony, mocking Gere's exile. What many in the audience laughed at was, for Gere, the painful reminder of a truth. A single moment of courage had cost him an entire career at the center of Hollywood. And yet, he never once expressed regret. For Richard Gere, the spotlight was never worth more than his conscience. He had spoken from the heart, and though Hollywood turned its back, he carried forward. The man who had once defined romance on screen was now defined by something far rarer in Hollywood: integrity. If the Oscars speech in 1993 had cost Richard Gere his place in Hollywood's inner circle, then what happened in 2007 nearly cost him his reputation overseas. That spring, Gere traveled to New Delhi to attend a public HIV/AIDS awareness event, an issue he had long championed. On stage with him was Bollywood star Shilpa Shetty, fresh from winning Big Brother UK and celebrated in India as a national icon. The atmosphere was festive, filled with cameras, music, and the energy of a good cause. But in an instant, everything changed. As the crowd cheered, Gere embraced Shetty warmly and, in a light-hearted Hollywood-style gesture, kissed her on the cheek several times. To American audiences, the act would have seemed harmless, even sweet. But in India, it sparked outrage. Within hours, conservative and nationalist groups erupted in protest. They called the gesture indecent, disrespectful to Indian women, and a public insult to the nation's values. Images of Richard Gere were burned in the streets. Effigies were stomped on. His name denounced in chants across television screens. It escalated far beyond cultural misunderstanding. It became a firestorm. Then came the unthinkable. A state court issued an arrest warrant for Richard Gere on charges of public obscenity. Even Shilpa Shetty herself, though clearly the recipient of the kiss and not its instigator, was dragged into court for allowing the incident. Gere, who had devoted so much of his life to humanitarian causes, suddenly found himself branded as a criminal in one of the world's largest democracies. The legal battle stretched on. Though the Indian Supreme Court dismissed the charges against Gere in 2008 as baseless, Shilpa Shetty didn't receive full exoneration until 2022, 15 long years later. For both stars, the incident was a reminder of how cultural differences can ignite into national scandals, especially under the watchful eye of a global media machine. When asked years later about the event, Gere's response was understated, almost weary. "I kissed her on the cheek. In the US, that's a polite gesture. In India, I learned a different lesson. No bitterness, no defensiveness, just an acknowledgement of the cultural divide." But for Gere, the damage was done. Already exiled from Hollywood for his politics, now he found himself vilified abroad for what he saw as an innocent act. Instead of lashing out or trying to repair his public image, he did what he had always done. He withdrew. He gave no lengthy interviews, no public apologies crafted by PR teams. He simply disappeared into silence, once again retreating to the quiet life he trusted more than the noise of fame. After the storm in India, Richard Gere made a choice that shocked many, but, in truth, had been building for years. He stepped away. No press tours, no angry counterattacks, no desperate attempts to cling to Hollywood relevance. He simply let go. While most stars fight tooth and nail to stay visible, Gere seemed almost relieved to vanish from the headlines. He retreated to his quiet estate in Pound Ridge, New York, where his life took on a rhythm entirely opposite to the chaos he had once known. Instead of red carpets, there were long hikes in the woods. Instead of paparazzi flashes, there was the sound of wind through trees. Meditation became his daily anchor, hours spent in silence, exploring the same spiritual practices he had first encountered decades earlier with Sylvia Martins. In one of his rare public comments during this time, Gere said softly, "If you stay quiet long enough, you'll hear what you need to hear." It was a philosophy that guided every choice he made. Rather than chasing blockbusters, he gravitated toward independent films that allowed him to work on his own terms. In Time Out of Mind, 2014, he portrayed a homeless man invisible to the city around him. To prepare, he wandered the streets of New York in worn clothes, unrecognizable, often mistaken for an actual vagrant. The performance wasn't glamorous, it was raw, vulnerable, almost painful to watch. Critics praised it, even if the box office did not. For Gere, that didn't matter. These roles gave him freedom, not applause. They mirrored his own sense of exile, his feeling of being cast out from Hollywood's system yet still alive, still searching for meaning. He no longer measured success by premieres or grosses. Instead, he asked himself whether the work felt true. Beyond acting, his humanitarian efforts grew stronger. He quietly funded organizations supporting Tibet, Hawaii AIDS relief in Africa, and homelessness initiatives in the U.S. Unlike other celebrities, he didn't hold press conferences or pose for cameras while giving oversized checks. He believed that true compassion needed no applause. "I do this to keep myself from being consumed by meaninglessness," he explained once. His lifestyle reflected the same simplicity. Vegan meals, spiritual texts, mindful living. It wasn't about longevity, but presence. "I don't care about returning to Hollywood," he admitted in an interview. "I care about how much wakeful time I have left in this life." In the end, Richard Gere didn't lose his place in Hollywood, he walked away from it. He wasn't diminished, he was transformed. By choosing silence over spectacle, Gere became something even rarer than a star, a man who lived exactly as he believed, regardless of the cost. If Hollywood was no longer a home for Richard Gere, the world beyond it became his true stage. For decades, Gere had been quietly involved in humanitarian causes, but once he stepped away from mainstream cinema, those efforts became his center of gravity. Unlike many celebrities who sought cameras while doing charity, Gere seemed almost allergic to publicity. He gave, he acted, he supported all without the fanfare. In 1999, he founded the Richard Gere Foundation, a platform that would grow to support hundreds of organizations across Asia, Africa, and the United States. Its focus was broad but deeply human: human rights, mental health, AIDS research, homelessness, and most of all, Tibet. His devotion to the Tibetan people was not a passing interest. It was a lifelong mission. He had studied Buddhism since his younger years, and his personal relationship with the Dalai Lama became a cornerstone of his identity. Gere didn't just speak for Tibet, he put his money, time, and reputation on the line for their cause. And it came at a cost. His political outspokenness, particularly his criticism of China, ensured that many of his films were blacklisted in one of the most lucrative box offices in the world. Major studios, increasingly reliant on Chinese distribution, began to view him as untouchable, but Gere accepted the consequences. For him, silence would have been the greater betrayal. His humanitarian work was never about a headline. He supported refugee aid programs in Europe, medical relief efforts in Africa, and food security initiatives in the United States. When hurricanes struck, when earthquakes devastated communities, his foundation quietly sent resources. Often, there were no photographs, no public acknowledgments. He once explained, "Compassion only has meaning when it asks for nothing in return." In Buddhist circles, Gere wasn't treated as a celebrity at all. He was simply another practitioner, devoted to meditation, simplicity, and service. He often joined monks in prayer sessions, not as a guest of honor, but as a student. He never tried to be a symbol yet to millions. That humility made him one. Through his films, he had once embodied romance and elegance. Through his activism, he became something rarer. Proof that a Hollywood legend could endure not by clinging to fame, but by using his influence for those who had none. For Richard Gere, legacy wasn't about roles remembered, but about lives touched. And in that way, he built a reputation far more lasting than any box office hit. By the mid-2022, Richard Gere had finally arrived at the place he had been searching for all along, not a stage, not a set, but a life that felt whole. After decades of moving between Hollywood lights and quiet retreats, he chose a new home with Alejandra Silva and their children in Madrid, Spain. It was a return not to fame, but to family. In interviews, Gere spoke with a serenity that suggested a man at peace. Alejandra, he said, was deeply fulfilled to be closer to her own family in Spain, and their sons Alexander, now 6, and James, 5, were thriving in local schools. They spoke both Spanish and English, played soccer with their classmates, and participated in community programs like Hogar C and Open Arms, initiatives supporting migrants and people in need. For Gere, seeing his boys grow in an environment grounded in compassion was far more rewarding than any film premiere. Life in Madrid was quiet, but it was never idle. In May 2025, Gere and Alejandra posted a rare family photo online. all of them wearing open-arms sweatshirts to raise awareness for refugees and patients in crisis across Europe. It was a simple picture, free from glamour, yet it resonated deeply with those who had followed Gere's journey, proof that his activism was not an image, but a way of life. Earlier that same year, Gere returned briefly to New York for the City Harvest Gala, this time accompanied by his eldest son, Homer, now 25. Together, they helped raise over 8.5 million meals for families in need. In a short, heartfelt speech, Gere said, "I'm always happy when I'm with my son, and being here tonight is something I'm proud of." It was a glimpse of the man behind the icon, a father, grateful for the chance to share his mission with the next generation. At the same time, Richard and Alejandra launched a new website for the Gere Foundation, consolidating decades of work into a single platform. It outlined their shared mission: refugee rights, homelessness prevention, global peacebuilding. Their joint statement read, "We are here to care for what hurts and for what's been forgotten." It wasn't just a slogan, it was a philosophy they lived daily. And then, in Dharamshala, during the 90th birthday celebration of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, Gere once again stood as both actor and activist, urging younger generations to carry forward Tibet's cultural and spiritual legacy. His voice was steady, free of bitterness, full of reverence for the teacher who had shaped his life. Today, Richard Gere no longer needs Hollywood to validate him. He no longer needs roles to remind the world of his power. At 75, he lives by the truth he once spoke: "What endures is not fame, but how one chooses to live and to love." And in that quiet life in Madrid, surrounded by family and guided by gratitude, Richard Gere has finally found the peace he spent a lifetime searching for. Richard Gere's legacy cannot be measured only in box office numbers or magazine covers. His life tells a different kind of Hollywood story, one not about chasing immortality through fame, but about learning how to walk away from it with dignity. In an industry obsessed with youth, spectacle, and noise, Gere proved that quietness could be just as powerful, that integrity could endure longer than applause, and that a single man's refusal to compromise could echo for decades. On screen, he reshaped the archetype of the leading man. He wasn't the booming action hero or the exaggerated charmer. He was elegant, introspective, and profoundly human. Films like Days of Heaven, American Gigolo, An Officer and a Gentleman, Pretty Woman, and Chicago showed audiences that masculinity could be seductive without arrogance, tender without weakness, and magnetic without words. His eyes, his stillness, his restraint became his signature, a style that influenced generations of actors who followed. Off-screen, his choices defined him even more. When most of Hollywood avoided politics, Gere risked his career by speaking about Tibet, sacrificing roles, premieres, and studio deals. When scandal threatened his image, he didn't retaliate with lawyers or spin doctors, he withdrew, trusting silence more than spectacle. And when he could have indulged in the comforts of wealth and celebrity, he instead turned toward meditation, activism, and family life, proving that his greatest role was not on film but in how he lived. The Richard Gere Foundation continues to fund humanitarian efforts across the world, supporting human rights, AIDS research, mental health care, and refugee aid. In Buddhist circles, he is not treated as a celebrity but as a practitioner, someone who genuinely seeks to live by the compassion he preaches. And to his family, he is not the Hollywood icon millions remember, but a husband and father who bows to his wife in gratitude and smiles with pride beside his children. Perhaps that is his truest legacy, not the red carpets or unforgettable roles, but the ability to remain himself when the world demanded he become something else. So maybe you remember him carrying Deborah Winger out of that factory, or smiling silently at Julia Roberts across a dinner table. Maybe it was just a glance, a smile, a moment that made your heart stop. Whatever it was, Richard Gere left a mark not just as an actor, but as a man who dared to live authentically. And now, as the credits roll on his long, extraordinary journey, one question lingers. What about you? Do you remember the first time Richard Gere appeared on your screen? Which role stayed in your heart all these years? Share your memories in the comments below. And if you'd like to keep walking this journey with us, exploring the icons who once meant the world, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell. Because the stories of legends like Richard Gere remind us of something simple, yet profound. In the end, what endures is not the fame we chase, but the love, the truth, and the peace we leave behind.